I'd like to start by first thanking the organizers of this very valuable symposium for inviting me to participate. I first became aware of the particular toxicity of solitary confinement when I was retained in a class action lawsuit challenging conditions of confinement at Massachusetts Walpole State Prison. I had no prior experience with the issue and was actually initially quite skeptical that I would find anything unusual. But the clinical observations I made at Walpole were shocking and unexpected. The prisoners who I evaluated were very symptomatic, quite clearly, and very frightened of what they were experiencing. And they were describing a set of symptoms that was not at all typical of what was seen in clinical psychiatric practice. They included massive perceptual disturbances, these things like hyperresponsivity to external stimuli, loss of perceptual constancy, things getting bigger, smaller, lights getting brighter and duller. None of these things are what we see in typical psychiatric practice. Simple hallucinations, dots, forms, mice, things that didn't necessarily have any meaning, often developing into more complex hallucinations. Very unusual. Um, and clearly, what we were looking at were problems with mental alertness, disturbances of thinking, concentration, and memory. In some cases, dissociative experiences, stupor and confusion, and even to the point of overt disorientation, massive confusion. Thought content, the people were focused on intrusive, somewhere, on intrusive obsessional ideas, conditions, their health, little bodily sensations would grow into these alarming things, and they would think they had cancer, etc. And vague shifting paranoid thoughts, which would sometimes develop into overt delusional preoccupations. In addition, there were affective disturbances, anxiety, massive anxiety, panic attacks, and then impulse discontrol, random violence sometimes, just random violence, along with, of course, self-directed violence and suicidality. The full syndrome, the people who were most severely affected, would develop an acute confusional psychosis with disorientation, subsequent amnesia for the episode, massive anxiety, paranoia, agitation, random violence, suicidality, and hallucinations in multiple spheres. We think of hearing and to some extent visual hallucinations, but we're talking here about kinesthetic hallucinations, olfactory hallucinations, hallucinations in multiple modalities. The course was also interesting. It was often a sudden onset, and the most acute symptoms would subside rapidly upon release from solitary confinement. What we were looking at clearly, for anyone who's knowledgeable in psychiatry, what we were actually looking at this point was delirium. And I quote from DSM-4, the criteria for diagnosis of delirium. And you'll see it's very, very similar. Inability to maintain and shift attention, impaired consciousness and thinking, disorientation, EEG slowing. And by the way, that has been found in solitary confinement. EEG slowing develops within days. Reversals of sleep-wake cycle, these same misperceptions, illusions, simple hallucinations, which are not the kind of things you're going to see in schizophrenia or manic depression or any of those illnesses. Marked fear, paranoia, agitation. And again, onset often sudden at night, and often people would have amnesia for the subsequent, for what happened to them after they recovered. Delirium is in fact not a syndrome associated with ordinary clinical practice in psychiatry. It's more typically seen in an ICU, the product of a derangement of the brain's internal activating system, caused, for example, by sepsis, congestive heart failure, hypoxia, and so forth. Very, very sick people. My observations of prisoners in solitary, therefore, bore witness to the fact that in addition to being a product of internal derangement, this syndrome can be caused by a profound reduction of external stimulation. But I certainly was not the first person to realize this either. Uh, it's been well known in medicine, ICU psychosis. Patients who had eye surgery and were eye patched could develop the same kind of things with disorientation, confusion, overt delirium, hearing impairment. The iron lung was a major problem with poliomyelitis patients, a major problem in the hospitals. These poor people would be, staring straight up, unable to move, unable to change their environment at all. And delirium, uh, psychosis was a major, major problem. It's also been seen in other situations, which are not as common nowadays. Prolonged traction for spinal patients is not used as nearly as much, and cardiac patients on bed rest for prolonged periods of time. These are just examples. It has, in fact, long been known that severe restriction of environmental and social stimulation has a profoundly deleterious effect on mental functioning. This issue has been, for example, been a major concern for many groups of patients, including the ones I just described. It has also been described in other non-medical situations. Rather interesting and exotic situations. Polar exploration, wintering over in workstations in the Arctic and Antarctic, especially the Antarctic workstations, is a major problem. There's been a lot written about it in the literature. Aviation, solo pilots flying long distances would develop this syndrome. Major concerns in submarines. There's been a lot of the US Navy, NASA, has spent a lot of money and a lot of time studying this. It was also observed among solo explorers, solo sailors, people sailing around the world. If you think about it, after a while, the sea is the sea is the sea, and the same kind of syndrome would develop. Arctic hunters in the night, with all the darkness and the white and a lack of variation in their environment. There's a very interesting syndrome among the Eskimos. Wintering over in the northern plains, it was sort of fascinating. Settlers, people who would settle in the northern plains, would be in these huts they would have constructed, and then during the winter they'd go out of their hut, and all there was whiteness, and the plains, white plains, and a number of them became delirious, confused. There was violence, there was paranoia, hallucinations, etc. More to the point, of course, the effect of restricted environmental stimulation in solitary confinement has been known for almost 200 years. The United States was actually the world leader in introducing prolonged incarceration and solitary confinement as a means of dealing with criminal behavior. The penitentiary system developed in the early 19th century, the brainchild of the Philadelphia Quakers. It was a product of a spirit of great social optimism about the possibility of rehabilitation of individuals with socially deviant behavior. And no expenses were spared in creating the ideal setting, or so they thought. And this is from a book by David Rothman, a very, very significant book describing the Philadelphia prison. The arrangements guaranteed that convicts would avoid all contamination and follow a path to reform. No precaution was excessive. Officials pulled a hood over the head of a new prisoner when marching him to his cell so he would not be seen by other inmates. He wouldn't be contaminated by them. Thrown upon his own innate sentiments, with no evil example to lead him astray, in total isolation, without companions, well, books are too a little complicated. He would return to the community cured of vice and idleness to take his place as a responsible citizen. You're giving these people a wonderful opportunity to become like penitent monks in their own monastic cell. And of course, that's the origin of the word, the penitentiary. It was started in a spirit of great social optimism. They thought they were doing wonderful things for these people. Well, the Americans were quite proud of their penitentiary system, and they invited and encouraged important visitors from abroad to observe it. Long-term in solitary, became very widespread, extending even to several European prison systems, which emulated the American model. Observers of this system from abroad were not always so impressed. This is a wonderful set of quotes from Charles Dickens when he visited the United States. And of course, as an important visitor, he visited the penitentiary. And this is what he saw. Listen to what he says here. He's not just describing illness, he's describing delirium. The inmate is a man buried alive, dead to everything but torturing anxieties and horrible despair. And then this next one, the first man I saw answered always with a strange kind of pause, confused. He fell into a strange stare as if he had forgotten something. Wonderful description of a delirious state. There was a sailor. Why does he stare at his hands and pick the flesh open and raise his eyes for an instant to those bare walls? Lovely description of a really horrible situation. The results of the American penitentiary system were in fact catastrophic. The incidence of mental disturbances among prisoners so detained and the severity of such disturbances was so great that the system fell into disfavor and was ultimately abandoned. During this process, a major body of clinical literature developed, especially among German clinicians, which documented the psychiatric disturbances created. The solitary confinement had become an administrative nightmare in these settings. I just want to very quickly go through some of these. The German clinicians, wonderfully precise observations: acute confusional state, sudden cessation, subsequent amnesia, hallucinations, delusions, severe anxiety, motor excitement. He screams, runs aimlessly about, destroys and ruins everything in his way. Wonderful descriptions. Such great clinical acumen. Delbruck advised the immediate termination of solitary. Prolonged absolute isolation has a very injurious effect on the body and mind and seems to predispose to hallucinations. Again, Summer, you can read this yourself. Hyperresponsivity to minor and inexplicable external stimuli leading to elementary then more complex hallucinations. And then Gooch, he termed this the psychosis of solitary confinement. You know, after I wrote my article in the American Journal of Psychiatry, I was often described as being the discoverer of the solitary confinement syndrome. Solitary confinement syndrome had been known for well over 100 years, just that nobody bothered looking. 84 cases he described: vivid hallucinations, persecutory delusions, etc., as you can see. And again, notice the precision of these observations, their recognition that this syndrome was very unlike, this very particular syndrome, very unlike those seen in typical psychiatric practice. The paradigmatic disturbance was an agitated confusional state, which in more severe cases had the characteristics of a florid delirium. Even among inmates who did not develop overt psychiatric illness as a result of confinement in solitary, such confinement almost inevitably imposed significant psychological pain during the period of confinement and often significantly impair the inmate's capacity to adapt successfully to the environment subsequently. By the latter half of the 19th century, this reality was in fact very well recognized, and the system of the penitentiary system fell into disfavor. The reality of it, though, was recognized even by our own United States Supreme Court. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the court's decision in this very interesting case of In re Medley. Mr. Medley had murdered his wife, was sentenced to death, but the law had changed. Under the old law, he would have been retained in the county jail for 30 days and then hung. Under the new law, instead, he'd be moved to the Colorado State Prison and serve anywhere from 0 to 45 days in solitary confinement. His lawyers argued that you couldn't possibly carry out this new law. It was ex post facto. It was an additional burden on him to be in solitary for 0 to 45 days when added to a sentence of death on the gallows. And this is what the Supreme Court said. This matter of solitary confinement is not a mere unimportant regulation as to the safekeeping of the prisoner. A considerable number of the prisoners fell after even a short confinement into a semi-fatuous condition from which it was next to impossible to arouse them. And others became violently insane. Others still committed suicide, while those who stood the ordeal better were not generally reformed and in most cases did not recover sufficient mental activity to be of any subsequent service to the community. Well, obviously, this syndrome was well known and its devastating effect was well known before the turn of the century. But dramatic concerns about the profound psychiatric effects of solitary reemerged in the 20th century. The alarm raised by the brainwashing of American prisoners of war and political prisoners by the Soviet Union and communist China, especially precipitated by the Korean War, gave rise to a major body of medical research concerning the effects of sensory deprivation, including profound sensory deprivation used as a model for studying this, and social isolation. And a lot was written at the time. There was a major concern about this. This is the Soviet detention facilities, surprisingly modern, well-built, spotlessly clean, but a critical feature of the management of political prisoners was a period of detention and total isolation. And this was a study commissioned by the State Department. The prisoner becomes increasingly anxious and restless, and his sleep is disturbed. He gradually gives up all spontaneous activity and ceases to care about his personal appearance and actions. He sits and stares as if he were in a daze, delirium. Ultimately, he seems to lose all of the restraints of ordinary behavior. He may soil himself, he weeps, he mutters. Some prisoners may become overtly delirious and have visual hallucinations. There was a GAP, a Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry symposium studying this, and despite the importance of other factors which tended to weaken personalities and make them more susceptible to forced indoctrination, social and sensory isolation was still the central pathogenic feature in such confinement. So this literature, as well as my own observations, has demonstrated that deprived of a sufficient level of environmental and social stimulation, individuals will soon become incapable of maintaining an adequate state of alertness and attention to the environment. Indeed, even a few days of solitary will predictably shift the EEG pattern towards an abnormal pattern characteristic of stupor and delirium. And interestingly, will also lead to hyperresponsivity to photic stimulus. This fact is in fact not really surprising. Most individuals have at one point or another experienced, at least briefly, the effects of intense monotony. After even a relatively brief period of time, an individual is likely to descend into a mental fog in which alertness, attention, and concentration become impaired. They become hyper-responsive to such stimulation, stimulation that comes into their being causes jar. They get jarred. They startle. Over time, the very absence of stimulation causes stimulation that is available to become noxious and irritating. An adequate state of responsiveness to the environment requires both the ability to achieve and to maintain an attentional set, to focus, and the ability to shift. The impairment of alertness and concentration in solitary leads to two related abnormalities. The inability to focus, the inability to maintain attention, is experienced as a kind of dissociative stupor, a mental fog in which the person cannot focus attention, cannot remember, cannot think, cannot concentrate. The inability to shift attention results in a kind of tunnel vision in which the person becomes obsessively fixated on some unpleasant or frightening thing, and they can't stop thinking about it. Individuals in solitary easily become preoccupied with some thought, some perceived slight by a guard or an irritation or a sound or a smell or bodily sensation, and they become tortured by it, unable to stop dwelling on it. Ordinary stimuli become intensely unpleasant, and small irritations become maddening. Those most severely affected by confinement in solitary experience states of florid psychotic delirium, marked by severe hallucinatory confusion, disorientation, and even incoherence, and by intense agitation and paranoia. Uh, these often have a dissociative character to them, and they often result in an amnesia for the events of the episode. Other individuals are less severely affected, but still will experience a degree of stupor, difficulties with thinking and concentration, obsessional thinking, agitation, irritability, and difficulty tolerating external stimuli. Moreover, although many of the acute symptoms suffered by these inmates are likely to subside upon termination of solitary, many will likely suffer permanent harm, and I've seen this over and over again. This harm is most commonly manifested by a continuing intolerance of social stimulation, a handicap which prevents the inmate from successfully readjusting to the broader social environment. And perhaps more significantly, often severely impairs the inmate's capacity to reintegrate into the broader community after their release from prison. In closing, it is hard not to reflect on the political situation we see around us today. If you think about it, the toxicity of solitary confinement cannot reasonably be disputed. Yet among those for whom the need to punish and control is too great, that reality is often disputed, and change is resisted fiercely. It is, in fact, all newspeak and alternate facts. That ultimately is and should be really frightening to us all. Thank you.